Hi, everyone, and welcome to this edition of the RavenCast. I'm excited to show you this episode with Martie Reineke. But before I do, I just wanted to give you a heads up that we had a little bit of audio problems, especially on my end. There was an echo in my audio, and I went through and fixed it pretty well. Fortunately, it didn't have any effect on what Martie had to say, and Martie says some really great stuff. Just a heads up, next week is Holy Week, so on the RavenCast, we're going to talk about some of the events of Holy Week, specifically Good Friday. Why is it that Christians call the death of Jesus a good day? Christianity is weird. Let's just say Christianity is weird, but we're also going to talk about why it's weird and also about resurrection and how we can begin to practice the resurrection life now. So that should be a great conversation. Hope you can join us next Thursday at 12 o'clock Central on the RavenCast. But until then, here is Martie Reineke on Disgust, Outrage, and Politics. Hope you enjoy. Hi, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the RavenCast for April 6th, 2017. I am Adam Erickson, and I am here with our special guest, Martie Reineke. Hi, Martha.
Hi.
How are you today?
Well, just fine.
Good.
Sunny
Awesome.
in Iowa, but it's cold.
So. Oh, goodness. Well, it's raining here in Portland, Oregon, like it will be forever. So, yeah.
Right.
It's awesome.
Right.
But hey, yeah, it's just what we do. But I am so excited to have you on today because we are going to talk about politics and disgust and outrage. And there is a lot to be disgusted and outraged about in our politics these days. So thank you for being with us.
Well, I'm very happy to be here.
Awesome. Before we get into our discussion, I'm just going to introduce the show and introduce you. So this is the RavenCast, a product of the Raven Review, which is an online magazine where we write and talk about mimetic theory and the rivalry, violence, and scapegoating that so often divides our communities. Our motto at the Raven Review is change your view, change the world. So if you like to hear new perspectives on religion, politics, pop culture, and current events, perspectives that seek to bridge divides and bring people together, then please subscribe to the Raven Review at ravenfoundation.org. But today, I am so pleased to have Dr. Martie Reineke on the show. Martie is professor of religion at the University of Northern Iowa. She teaches courses on religion and society, world religions, religion and the web, and existentialism and gender. She is the author of numerous articles and books, including the wonderful book that I'll put up for those watching called Intimate Domain. Here it is. Yeah. Martie, I first met you 10 years ago or so at a conference, I think probably in Amsterdam at the Colloquium on Violence and Religion. And I was just learning mimetic theory at the time. And I've always experienced you as somebody who is not only really nice and warm, but helpfully informative about all things mimetic theory. So just thank you for your presence and helpfulness in our lives. Yeah. And also, just a little story. We were flying home from Amsterdam, and I was sitting right in the row in front of Martie, and I was so excited that Martie would be behind me for this 12-hour flight that I sat up and I leaned into the space between us, and I said, "Hey, Martie," and I totally freaked you out, and I'm sorry about that.
That's okay.
Yeah, good. It was a long flight, and I kept my space, so that's good. Awesome. So, Martie, I just wanted to ask you, how were you first introduced to mimetic theory?
Well, that's a great question. It was a long time ago. It was actually just a year after Girard's book, The Scapegoat, had been published. And I was talking to a colleague about my interests at the time, and he said, "You need to read The Scapegoat by René Girard." And I was like, okay. And so I sat down, I got it immediately, I read it, and everything changed. I often, I guess about once every 3 years, I read a book and I feel like the top of my head is just coming off as I read. And that The Scapegoat was one of those books. And what captured my attention about The Scapegoat was I had been studying difference, particularly sexual difference, gender, and the feminist scholars I was reading thought that one of the issues about gender bias was the difference of women from men, and that women were considered deficient in certain respects. And when I read The Scapegoat, Girard says that the problem of others is not their difference, but their similarity. And he actually gives the example of disability in The Scapegoat. And he says, what bothers us about the disabled person is not their difference from us, but that they are too close. They are similar enough that we feel threatened, that perhaps their situation, their disability, there might be a contagion. It might spread to us. And the absence of boundaries is what we find disturbing, and that initiates the social consequences in terms of sexism, racism, etc. And that turned my world upside down. And I thought, well, let's see if we can work with this theory. And I've never stopped working with it. I tested it in my first book, and it was like, yes, this helps. And then I've just kept asking the theory to serve to help me answer other questions that interest me, such as disgust. So
yeah, it is very counterintuitive.
Yes,
because we always think that it's our differences that cause these problems, but Renee says it's our similarities.
Right.
So it's always something that takes a while. For you, it clicked right away. It sounds like, but for me, it's always been.
Well, it clicked in the sense that I hadn't been satisfied with other answers. So I thought maybe that was the problem, that the reason I hadn't been satisfied is they just were not going to work. And so I was very open to his ideas. And I think the similarity, the angle that we often start with is a positive similarity, that in Girard's theory, we have a model who we admire, and we discover that we want everything to be like the model. But the closer we get to the model and to the kind of competition with that model, then the model's face, instead of being a model, becomes a monster. And then it flips over to the threat of similarity. So the scapegoat picks up the conversation when you've gotten past the point of modeling desire and admiring the person and wanting to be just like that person, when it is flipped over to, no, this is too close, this is a threat.
So it begins in a positive sense and generally moves in a negative mimesis.
Right.
Right. Yeah. One of the books that your most recent book, I think, is Intimate Domain, and it deals with family, which is where we find our first models in life. And it's a fascinating book, Intimate Domain, Desire, Trauma, and Mimetic Theory. And as you say, Girard talks a lot about sibling rivalry, and he warns us throughout his career about negative mimesis. But you claim that families can be a place of intimate domain. And what you mean by that is a space for healing from trauma and a place for positive mimesis. Can you talk more about family as a place of intimate domain?
Right. Well, I came to work on the family because Girard doesn't. He, apart from siblings, he has very little to say about the family. And I think one reason is that he was distinguishing himself in his early work from Freud, and the model of mimetic desire that Freud has is the Oedipal triangle. It's a familial model. And I think Girard thought that that model was a little forced. He also talks about how his own recollections of family life as a child were that the family was a safe space. And the kind of conflict that Freud sees, he said, well, that doesn't fit with my experience. So Girard stopped looking at the family, and I think he lost something in that. Now he does look at siblings as examples of rivals, and we know if we have siblings that is the case. We often are rivals. We can get very intense in our competition with our siblings, and Girard was right about that. But he also needs to look, I think he needed to look more at parental dynamics as setting patterns for how we will relate with others for the rest of our lives. And some of these patterns are negative, so that the patterns we learn for interaction with certain types of persons are set in childhood for better or worse. I had a colleague who had it work out quite well. He ended up working for a dean at my university who's now gone. And he was the only person in his college who could get along with this dean. And someone asked him, "How do you do it?" And he said, "He's my dad. He's just like my dad." And he said, "I learned how to get along with my dad." And the pattern, but many times the pattern doesn't work. We get set in a pattern and it becomes counterproductive and limits our experiences. So Freud focused largely on how that happens, how familial experiences create trauma that we carry with us in our lives and that limit our ability to be open to other options. But in my book, I wanted to also look at the possibility for a positive structure of family life. And I went way, way back to childhood prior to the acquisition of language. And there we have encounters with parents, not through the words they share with us, but through their bodies, through their voices, even though we don't understand their words, their touch. And several philosophers, among them Merleau-Ponty and then Julia Kristeva, have talked about that early experience as setting the stage for a openness to the world. And Kristeva actually uses the language of the parents, the pre-parents, before we know them how to call them mama and papa. Their sense of being, we are forgiven by them. And she means we are given for the world by these parental presences, that they carry us literally into the world with a feeling of safety. And we need to return to that somehow in adult life to experience healing in adult relationships. Now, with siblings, prior to the competition where you want the same toy and you're fighting over it, or your brother gets an A and you get a B, and your parents are happier with your brother than they are with you, in early childhood, when a 2-year-old discovers that he or she's going to have a sibling, their initial response, developmental psychologists tell us, is positive. There's going to be more of them. Their world will expand. And so the idea I had an intimate domain was there for all aspects of the family before they get into the complexities of the world, have a positive turn to them, a promise of relationship rather than the failure of relationship. And then my interest is, how do we recapture that in adulthood? And religion, particularly rituals, symbol systems, are ways that we can return to that hopeful stance that we had when we first entered the world and had our most fundamental first relationships.
It reminds me of a conversation I had with Vanessa Avery a couple weeks ago, and she was talking about in Genesis 48, where Manasseh and Ephraim are blessed. They're brothers. And it's a story that doesn't get a lot of attention. But they're both blessed, which is a reversal of Esau and Jacob, who have this rivalry for blessing. And here both these brothers are able to accept the blessing.
It's a ritual that Jews do every Sabbath. This blessing of these children, it's an imitation of Ephraim and Manasseh.
Right. See, that is a perfect example of what I was saying, that where do we recapture the hope of early childhood? And it's in religion. Christopher says it's in art and literature. And a blessing is both that physical recollection of the parental touch as a healing touch, a welcoming, a safe touch, and also being able to articulate as adults in words that the early sentiments of blessing, of feeling part of a larger community.
So, Martie, this conversation about family is so important, especially now, because families are divided over our political situation. I am feeling disgust and outraged for family members that I love. And in a recent paper that you wrote called Disgust, Violence, and Politics, you name what has been so difficult during the last few months, especially at the Thanksgiving dinner table. When it was just hard for us to be in the presence of family members. You write that the prospect of eating with someone who disgusts us makes us want to puke. And a lot of people felt that over the Thanksgiving dinner table, and ever since. It's a feeling of disgust, of social disgust. Can you talk about what is disgust and social disgust?
Right. Well, I came upon the topic of disgust because it's really falling two ways. It's at the dinner table when we have these strong political disagreements with each other, and we may even use the word disgust to describe how we feel about what someone else is saying. But it's also, I noticed, in our political commentary, so that one of the things that I have been trying to understand is how disgust is featuring on that political landscape. And during the campaign, there were some incidents that candidate Trump talked about in terms of his disgust. So when he did the debate and Megyn Kelly challenged him, he had comments about her and the fact that she must have been having her period, and he found that disgusting. When candidate Clinton took a bathroom break, he said, "I know where she went. I won't say where she went. It's too disgusting to say." And during the Women's March, Madonna was on the stage, and he said that her appearance was disgusting. So that's a word that comes out of his mouth fairly often. And the other thing that's concerning to me is that in some of the public incidents about the Islam, that Muslims have been referred to with words that are part of the vocabulary of disgust. So a number of mosques a couple of weeks ago received the same letter. The mosque in Des Moines received one, which was the same as one that was received in Indianapolis and various other places. And the language of that letter talked about Muslims being vile, which is very close to being a synonym for disgust. And it talked about them needing to be removed and use the language that America needs to become clean again, which again is right out of the vocabulary of disgust. So when we're talking about disgust, I discovered while I was researching it that Martha Nussbaum, who is one of our top philosophers of law, had written a book called Hiding from Humanity that's about disgust, and helpfully for my interests also about outrage, because in our political scene, if we are not disgusted, we are outraged. So we go to our computer screens and we bring up the news and we either say that's disgusting or that's outrageous. It's one or the other. So I look first at what she says about disgust, and disgust is not subject to reason. It is something that wells up in us. There's a kind of magical thinking associated with it. And one reason that we know that it's not subject to reason is we can test that by confronting someone with a reasoned explanation of why they should not find something disgusting. So, for example, bats. Some persons are fine with bats. They love bats. I'm talking about the furry things that fly around silently. And they eat mosquitoes, and they are helpful for our environment, et cetera, et cetera. Well, no amount of explanation for me about how wonderful bats are is going to change my mind that I find them disgusting. I've had some close encounters with bats, and I find them creepy and disgusting, and I don't want any of them to be part of my life. So reason doesn't stop disgust. Disgust operates on a pre-reasonable level, but that doesn't mean it can't be analyzed. And it actually, it's all the more important that we analyze it. So that was one of the things that I set out to do in the last few months, is to see, can we get a better sense of what's going on with disgust than we have had in the past? Because if that's a driver in our political present, then its very unreasonableness suggests that we need to look very closely at it.
One of the interesting examples that you give when it comes to politics in this is the politician, I forget who it was, who had the mud Oreo and the worms coming out of it at his conference.
Right. Yes,
that?
so that's actually, there's a whole area of psychology. It's called disgust psychology. I think that would be fascinating. I mean, I can imagine if I were teaching a course, disgust psychology, everyone would want to take it, right? But there's a group of psychologists working in this field, and they're interested actually in the relationship between politics and disgust. And so one of the things that they did was they did some surveys of persons in their study for their political attitudes. And they discovered that persons who describe themselves as conservative politically and also very pro-military defense, when shown pictures of disgusting images, such as someone eating worms, will have a much stronger reaction than
I have kind of a strong reaction.
Survey are politically liberal. Yeah. Right. So one of our senators, every year he does his name's Jeff Flake. He's from Arizona. And every year he does a little booklet on wasted federal research funds. And last year, the top waste in federal research funds was for this group of psychologists and that particular study. And so Senator Flake at his news conference gave the pudding cups that have gummy worms in them to everyone as an illustration. But I actually think that their research is important, and we need a multidisciplinary approach to disgust. So we need persons who are doing the kind of empirical research, large survey studies that the disgust psychologists are doing. And we need folks like Gerard, who talks about contamination and pollution. And we need folks like Martha Nussbaum, who says, well, what are we going to do about it as political philosophers? So we need a multidimensional approach to solving the problem of disgust.
Yeah. So there's disgust, and disgust is often met with outrage.
Yeah, so let me talk about the difference. Okay, so disgust, as we've said, is something that comes over you. You, at some level, you have a physical reaction. You may feel nauseous, right? So it is, and that cannot be eliminated by telling someone a reasoned explanation for their experience. So if you give someone something to eat that looks disgusting, for example, it looks like a bug or a worm, and you say, no, it's actually not that, it's actually delicious chocolate, they may still not be able to eat it because it's an irrational feeling. Outrage, Martha Nussbaum says, outrage is quite different. Outrage has an affective component. I mean, we feel ourselves welling up with what looks like anger, but she distinguishes anger from outrage. And outrage if you say, what are you outraged about? You'll be able to say, well, and you'll be able to cite facts and figures, sometimes more, sometimes less. And she says that the affect in outrage is moving toward social justice, so that you are you're summoning facts and you're summoning emotions on behalf of a larger agenda, social justice. So there is a kind of method in your madness, whereas disgust doesn't have that dimension. Now, she is very careful, because some of us will be saying, oh, I have outrage, I'm a good person, I'm a liberal, and outrage is good, disgust is conservative, that's bad. And we'll be patting ourselves on the back. And Martha Nussbaum says, no, don't do that. For what? And she doesn't use the language of scapegoating, but that's what she's talking about, that we can end up scapegoating others by placing ourselves in the position of the better side of the story. And also our vocabulary, she says, sometimes we say we're outraged, but we're actually disgusted. And she says that happens because there isn't a good adjective if you are extremely outraged. You can say, I'm very, very, very outraged, and you're just not getting there. You're not getting to the ultimate degree of outrage. So she says some people flip over and say, I'm disgusted at that point, because they're looking for a stronger word. But if you ask them, what are they disgusted about? Then they go into reasons, etc., and you discover, no, they meant outrage. Their vocabulary fell short. And she also says, for example, in the 19th century, there were a lot of trials focused on homosexuality, which purported to be reasonable, rational trials. These are court cases for the illegality of homosexual behavior. And they purported to be about outrage and justice. But if you look at what the attorneys said, there was no reason to what they were saying. They were clearly disgusted by behaviors, and the rational language was secondary to the motivation of disgust. So the words are not always completely reliable in letting us know what's going on, but they are definitely two different places that we can stand in the world. And she wants to look further at outrage as having positive potential, and disgust as something that we need to work our way around as much as we can to neutralize its affective powers.
One of the great examples that you give of outrage is Martin Luther King.
Right.
Right. So he was able to use outrage in a way that, as you say, works for social justice in the world.
Right. And she doesn't have a lot of examples, because she actually, in a later book that she calls Anger and Forgiveness, I think after the book on disgust and outrage, she started thinking more about it, whether she had offered too positive a view of anger as outrage. And so in Anger and Forgiveness, she unpacks all the varieties of anger. And she actually says that almost all anger is what we would call in Girardian language scapegoating anger. It's anger towards vengeance, towards destruction. And she actually stops using the word outrage, because she thinks that isn't, she thinks because it's so much part of our common vocabulary, we will, again, pat ourselves on the back and say, no, I don't have vengeance, I have outrage, I'm a good person, I'm leaning towards social justice. And she picks a new term for outrage called transition anger. And she says, I'm picking it, it sounds like an academic term, and I want to pick a term that won't roll off your tongue, because your chances of actually having outrage leading towards social justice, transition anger, are so slim, you're not going to need to use this word in your life. So what is it? She says Martin Luther King Jr. is an example. It's a prophetic voice, a voice where compassion actually is stronger than the vengeance, and therefore the anger is constructive. We sometimes use the phrase speaking truth to power. And so when outrage is speaking truth, has a clear line on social justice, then it's a good affect, but it's joined with reason. But most of the time we fall off the rails, she says. And I think one of the things I'm noticing in our experience today when I go on Facebook, for example, and I'm part of a couple of Facebook groups with Indivisible, is that the outrage does either turn into angry expressions that don't seem to be pointed towards a productive resolution, or into paralysis, and where you just sort of step back, because to pursue your outrage is to go in directions you clearly recognize at some level are not productive. And I think it's important for us to therefore look at both outrage and see how can we get back to its healthy components. How can we make it more than just academic, as Nussbaum seems to be thinking it's so rare that it's just what we say, just academic, meaning it's in an ivory tower and no one ever actually gets to experience that.
It makes me think that maybe we should, if outrage leading to something good is so slim, should we seek other ways of being in the world? Should we seek to lessen our outrage?
Well, that's a really good question. I think for in my own thought, I've actually been encouraged by Nussbaum to think we might have more of an impact on tackling disgust than on outrage, because outrage does have a capability of being responsive to reasoned argument. And I think we've probed and pushed with our, what we call at the university, teaching critical thinking skills as much as we can. I think we can always do better. We can always encourage more civil dialogue. We can have models of civil dialogue. For example, the tone that is taken by commentators on National Public Radio or on public television tends to have that quality of reasoned discourse, which suggests a model for managing outrage and not having it turn into vengeful anger. But at the moment, I'm more concerned about, and I'm more interested in tackling disgust, because I think that is the more dangerous problem we have, particularly when we look at political objectives coming out of the White House, such as the travel ban and other efforts to address perceived threats with what are purported to be rational suggestions, such as a ban, but which I think, like those trials in the 19th century on homosexuality, are really being driven by disgust and an affect that has not been examined.
That's great. Suzanne has a question that leads us back to disgust. She has also a question, I think, about outrage. But let's do disgust. And I'm getting back. So Martie, I think you can see Suzanne's question over there.
Right. So Suzanne is asking if disgust works the way that difference and conflict do, that we are disgusted by things too close or similar to us. I think, yes, that's the case. One of the things I found very helpful is that Richard Beck, who is a psychologist and also a theologian, has unpacked the dynamics of disgust to identify 3 kinds of disgust. And I think all 3 of them point to a problem of insufficient boundaries. And it's really interesting that you would ask that, because one of my concerns about focusing only on conflict and scapegoating, as Girard has, is that we won't be able to work our way out of that until we look at one of the other prime drivers of threatening similarity, which is disgust, rather than the anger that leads to violence, that leads to scapegoating. Because I think they're 2 distinct trajectories, and that's why it was very helpful that Martha Nussbaum also treats them as two. Disgust is one track of the train, and the other is the violent scapegoating. So Beck starts with what he calls core disgust, and core disgust is the most embodied form of disgust, where someone or something makes us gag, literally. And it has the most involuntary responses. And that really is embodied, so that when we are standing close to someone who we find disgusting, something about their body is disgusting in terms of their smell, or they happen to be throwing up or whatever, we will have a gagging response. And they are hopefully like 12 inches away from us. We are not really physically threatened by that person in terms of whatever is happening to them having a kind of contagion to us, but we experience it as this kind of involuntary reaction. And you can be in a room where multiple persons start gagging. It's a contagion of gagging. Okay, so that's the most basic. And some persons would say, well, why worry about that? That's so fundamentally physiological. How could it ever issue in anything of social consequence? Well, I think it's important to start with that layer, because it reminds us that disgust is always embodied, no matter how complex it becomes and filled with a sort of a language parameter around it. It is an embodied reaction. And then, so we need to look at that. Okay, so then he goes on to animal reminder disgust. And that is disgust where we are acquainted with our own fragility, mortality, and potential for disease, death, disability. And that fits right into what Girard talked about when he gave the example of disability, that the problem with persons who look different than us, who remind us of our own mortality and the fragility of our own circumstances, is an over-identification at a very fundamental lived level that it could happen to us. So one of the sad things that humans tend to do if we don't have enough rituals in our lives is, after someone we know has a loved one who dies and needs all their friends around them, people report over and over that they are left after the funeral, after the baked goods stop coming to the door, that they are left alone, and the people that used to be friends tend to avoid them at the time they need them most. And that's, I think, contemporary testimony to the concern about the contagion of death. And we're concerned at not a reasonable level, but an irrational level, that death is a contagion. And that level of disgust is met finally at the most complex level with socio-moral disgust. And socio-moral is where a group of persons, we find them, as we say, disgusting, and that level is identical in its construct to the scapegoating mechanism that Girard has identified, with the difference that with socio-moral disgust, those who study it focus on the embodiment of scapegoating. And so Beck talks about the table, because he's also a theologian, the table fellowship in Matthew, the debates about who can sit at the table with us, which were very much political debates for an developing early Christian group, a Jesus movement that was still meeting in the synagogue and trying to decide, is Jesus the future of Judaism? And were in the process of worrying about who they were eating with and the disgusting prospects of polluted food, but also were moving towards potential scapegoating of those that they saw as a threat to the purity of table fellowship. So they all fit together, and I agree. I think it's the problem of over similarity. If we had, that's why we're building a wall, right? That's why we build literal walls to create barriers where the fundamental fear is of a contagion that can't be stopped by a wall.
Oh, well, I love the table fellowship point because it brings me back to Thanksgiving. And these are issues that we have been dealing with for a very long time. So one of the other things that I have a question about is monsters. You mentioned this earlier. What is the difference between scapegoats and monsters?
Right. Well, first, let me follow up for just a second on that table fellowship, because when I was growing up in a Christian congregation that where there were sermons, and there were sermons on the table fellowship debates, they were all these conversations were about rules. So the focus of supposedly what these debates were about were, what are the rules for sitting down together and having a sacred meal, and then it would extend into the rules of ritual. And supposedly Jesus was wanting a kind of flexibility and inclusiveness, and there were these rule-bound persons. But what Beck points out, and he's saying, that's not what this is about. Think about sitting at a table, Thanksgiving table, with people who are differing from you in whatever respect they're differing from you in, and they make you want to puke. That's what that debate is about. It's not intellectual. It's not about rules. That actually is a scapegoating of the Pharisees to say that it is about rules. It's about, what do we do when we are invited into a community to sit at a table with kinds of people we've never sat with before, and we can't eat because we literally can't stomach the thought of eating with those people. And that gets at the radicality of what Jesus was trying to do, to break through barriers that reason can't address, barriers that are so deep and refer to the kinds of deep threats of our mortality, of our fragility, our incompleteness, etc., that we need some other way of getting at that. So I think that helps that particular conversation in the New Testament come alive, because we domesticate Jesus way too often. We want to control the message, because when we control messages, we get to be placed in a good position. We're like, yeah, we've got the message, and we're on the right side of that message. What a profound experience of those Matthew texts does is destabilize that certainty and disenfranchise us from that security. And it's from that unstable position that we can experience something quite different, which would be the radical message of Jesus. So I like to stick with that story. I think Beckett, his book is called Unclean, and he frames the entire book around the table fellowship question. Now, the other really big contribution that Beck makes to the discussion of scapegoating is, and he cites Girard when he does this, is that we have become sophisticated when it comes to identifying scapegoats. At least everybody's scapegoats but our own. In fact, the word scapegoat, as Girard tells us, the vocabulary now, a scapegoat is an innocent person who has been wrongly accused of something. Whereas the power of the scapegoat historically, before that revelation that scapegoats are innocent, was that the scapegoat was guilty. And the scapegoat was the being that a divided people agreed upon as being the cause of their collective problems, and instead of fighting each other, they'd say, oh, it's that person's fault or that group's fault, and that group, the scapegoat, would be let out of town, expelled or killed, and everybody could go back to living as normal. And so scapegoating diffused cultural violence by excluding it from the community over time. And the biblical message, Girard says, taught us, and we finally have absorbed, that scapegoats are not guilty, they're innocent. And so scapegoating doesn't pull the neutralize the ongoing dynamic of what we've been talking about today, anger or violence. It just can run on and on and on. And so in Girard's, one of his last books, Battling to the End, he muses about the risks of runaway violence when the scapegoating mechanism, which was supposed to stop it by placing that in a receptacle, the scapegoat, and moving it outside the community to protect the community from that threat. That doesn't work. What do we have? And Beck says there's one place where scapegoating still works really, really well, and that's the beings we call monsters. And all you have to do is go on Google and type the word monster in next to any candidate group: monster Muslim, monster, homicide. When we want to ostracize someone from our community and find them, what we'd say, beyond the pale, and still give them the power to do what scapegoats used to do, we call them monsters. And monsters work in the area of disgust. They're not, who becomes a monster? There's no reason for that. It's not subject to facts. You can say, oh no, you're mistaken. That person is not a monster, and cite all their credentials. And no, if they are a monster to us, they are guilty as charged. And so Beck's final suggestion is, if we want to have interventions in social justice today, don't look for scapegoats. After all, we're not going to recognize the ones that we still are creating. We'll look for monsters. Monsters have the power that scapegoats used to have. And then if we want to reform our communities and not pick on individuals and groups and label them monsters and exile them or kill them, then we need to address the monster work that we're doing rather than the scapegoating work.
And the way that you do that is by neutralizing disgust.
Right. So that you look for mechanisms that will interrupt that affective current of the disgust, the core disgust, the animal reminder disgust, and the socio-moral disgust. Right.
So Julia Kristeva is influential in your work. Can you talk about her and her remedy for disgust?
Right. So I've identified 2 remedies for disgust, and the 2 that Kristeva really specializes in are the core disgust, which is really hard to remedy, and the animal reminder disgust, the fear of our mortality. And then I've identified for socio-moral disgust some avenues that Beck has. But for Kristeva, she suggests that the avenue that we could follow to working to neutralize, and if you think about a liquid, a poisonous liquid, and pouring something into it that neutralizes it, I'm really thinking that. And she talks about forgiveness, and she's not talking about cheap forgiveness, like, oh, I forgive you. That we're not talking about that. It's feeding into or deploying, or I guess resurrecting from our depths, that initial capacity we had to live with others without fear, that forgiveness with a hyphen between the for meaning before, and given, that something has been given to us before what? Before we ever entered into the complexities of social life, we were forgiven, we were given over to that by hopeful parents, by a promise that we could live with each other in this world. And she identifies, as we mentioned before, 3 places where we can actually experience forgiveness. She thinks that the rituals of religion, particularly healing rituals, and we think about Jesus, in addition to all of his sermons, which were guides for life that we can summon as words to live by, his primary power was as a healer. And he healed persons who, in that day, disease was considered a moral failing. So if you had something wrong physically with you, it was a mark of a failure of your being, not just that you had what today we would say a virus or a bacterial infection or whatever. And so he healed broken people. He healed people who were contaminated others. And if we can capture through religion, through rituals of healing, that would be something to do. She also identifies, and we live in a world where many persons are not religious. The nuns, the NONES, are growing every year. And so she identifies art and literature as places that we can turn to for healing affect. Yes, art doesn't have often words, so we can say, oh yes, I look at a painting and there's something that's transforming, but much art, theater, for example, plays, literature have words. But she says it's not the words that are healing, it's entering into a world of affect. And I was reminded of a political statement, actually. I heard the other day, there's been talk about defunding the National Endowment for the Humanities. And during the war, Churchill was asked about the arts, and he said something to the effect, that's what we're fighting for. And the sense that art is the crucible of the hope of civilization is one that I think secular people could recognize it. Art can heal in that way. So those are the places to look for interventions in disgust. Now, the other place Beck suggests for socio-moral disgust is practices of hospitality. And the biblical religions are experts on practicing hospitality in lands and times in which it's difficult to be hospitable. And that they were really transforming, Judaism, Christianity, Islam were really transforming presences in the Middle East in terms of promoting hospitality towards the stranger. And he talks about hospitality as an outreach to others. You reach out, and if you can be hospitable to the monster. And I know it sounds, I mean, we're dealing with huge issues, and especially if we look at the news the last 2 days, we're just sort of overwhelmed by geopolitical problems that don't have easy answers. But they say all politics is local. And I think one of the things that many communities are doing are having interfaith dinners, so that in our community, we have potlucks where Christians, Jews, and Muslims meet together to share a common meal. And I think that hospitality to persons who, before they show up to eat together, have been strangers to each other and who, in some cases, have been called monsters by others. I don't think we can underrate the potential of individual small communities' gestures of hospitality as a way of breaking through the powers of disgust.
Yeah, you end your paper on this note of hope, that violence can be exchanged for forgiveness and hospitality. And I appreciate that so much, precisely because, as you say, we're in this geopolitical situation where we have North Korea with nuclear weapons, Syria using chemical weapons on their own people. The United States continues drone attacks throughout the Middle East. And everybody just thinks that violence is the way to solve our problems. And maybe it's just being hospitable towards the people who are around us, living in the spirit of forgiveness, that gives me hope.
Yeah, I think it's a really important concept. I know in my world religions class, we're actually about to start the unit on Islam, and there are three-minute videos of young Muslims who are talking about their being a Muslim. And the first one is a highly assimilated group of young people talking about how they can dance and do things just like anyone else. And then there's a second one by what we call observant young Muslims who are talking about the strength of their faith. And then the third one actually is by young people who say, it's not my job to make you comfortable with my faith. And really posing challenging questions. And I ask my students, if I could show just one of these to another class, which would you pick? And I've done this for 2 years now, and they pick the challenging one. And I think what that reminds me is that hospitality isn't this easy, we'll just open our doors and be nice to each other. You can be hospitable to the stranger and welcome a stranger who challenges you on presumptions that you've had that have made that other person feel more of a stranger than was rightly should have been. And so I think it's important. Hospitality isn't rolling out a carpet and just engaging in banal conversation with others. It's listening to others and hearing where they're coming from and their pain. And a kind of, the word responsibility has the word response in it. Responsive, it's the part of the family. And so I think with responsibility, responsiveness is part of hospitality. So.
It reminds me that whenever I try to do inter-religious dialogue, it's always with progressive Muslims or progressive Jews, and we always end up believing the same things. And maybe it's more important to do intra-religious dialogue, like with conservative Christians.
Right. No, I agree, because that's the more challenging test of how we are going to manage our potential for disgust and potential for anger, as opposed to an outrage that might have some productive possibilities in conversation. Yeah.
Hey, so at this point in the live conversation, we had really bad echo, so we decided to stop. So I just wanted to thank Martie Reineke for being with us. I loved what she said about anger and outrage and disgust and how to neutralize these emotions, really starve these emotions through radical forgiveness, which is not cheap forgiveness, but a forgiveness that seeks the capacity to live with those that we tend to otherize, by a promise that we can live with each other in this world. Oh, so great. And also hospitality. Not just hospitality towards people that we like and think like us, but hospitality also towards those that we otherize. It's this intentional way of being in the world that we really get the first glimpse of in the biblical stories, including the Quran. So really powerful stuff. Thank you, Martie, for being here. And thanks to everybody who joined the live show. And thank you for listening right now. If you are listening on YouTube or watching on YouTube, as the case may be, please give us a thumbs up and share this video if you think it deserves it with those of your friends, Yeah, let's say it like that. And if you are watching, actually you would be listening on iTunes and Stitcher, please give us a 5-star review, and again, share this with anybody you think might like it. And if you want to stay up to date on the RavenCast, please like the RavenCast Facebook page or the Raven Foundation Facebook page. And you can stay up to date on everything Raven Review oriented by subscribing to the Raven Review website at ravenfoundation.org. So thanks again for being here. Hope you can join us next week when we talk about, it's going to be Holy Week. So we're going to talk about Good Friday and resurrection, how to live the resurrection life in this world. So hope you can join us next Thursday at 12 o'clock Central. Until then, grace and peace be with you. Bye-bye.